I had not rejected the idea of a fated mate because I was proud. I had simply stopped believing she existed. 11 years on the high seat of Ashenmere teaches a man to be precise about what he wants and honest about what he has given up. I wanted my border wolves found. I wanted the boundary fever contained before it moved inland. I wanted my council to stop watching me from the corner of their eyes as though I might one day crack under the weight of ruling alone. I did not want a woman brought before me in chains. I said so clearly when Hendrik Vale, my captain of the border guard, sent word ahead, "She's in custody, my lord, for trespass." I sent back, "She is not in chains. She walks in on her own feet or she doesn't walk in at all." Hendrik knew me well enough not to argue. He also knew well enough to write a second message, which arrived an hour after the first. She asked if she could finish bandaging the gray one's leg before we left. I said yes. I thought you'd want to know. I read that twice. Then I went down to the great hall of Ashenmere Keep and sat in the high seat and waited. The hall was long and low-ceilinged, built into the roots of the old drowned forest that gave Velthar its character. Half the keep's walls were living wood, sealed generations ago against the wet, dark heartwood, pressed close enough to the torch brackets that the light fell amber and close. The floor was worn stone, smooth as river slate. The fire at the far end had been burning for so long that the hearthstones were black 3 inches deep. My wolves lay around it in the way they always had, not by arrangement, not by instruction, simply by preference and habit, bodies curved toward the warmth, eyes half open. 23 of them were in the hall that morning. 2 of the eldest, Sareth, and the one we had always called the Old Pale, who had no other name that I knew, had not left the hearthstone in longer than I could clearly remember. Years, perhaps a decade. They moved when it was necessary and not otherwise, and I had learned to read their stillness as a kind of contentment rather than age, though I suspected it was some of both. My council filed in. Hendrik filed in behind them, and then the doors at the far end of the hall opened and Maren Ashby walked through them. She was not what I had expected. I am not sure what I had expected, someone frightened, perhaps, or someone aggressive in the way of a person who uses noise to cover fear. She was neither. She was a woman of middling height in a plain wool traveling coat that had been mended at the left elbow, carrying a healer's satchel over one shoulder as though she had simply forgotten to set it down. Her hair was pinned back with the efficient carelessness of someone who had done it in the dark on the road and not thought about it since. She looked at the hall, the high seat, the torches, the council arranged in their formal places, with the calm, unhurried attention of a person taking inventory. She looked at the wolves last. Not with fear, with something that looked from where I sat very much like recognition. I filed that away. Hendrik cleared his throat. "My Lord Kedron, I present Maren Ashby, found within Crown territory on the Velthar boundary line on the evening of the 4th, treating 3 of the border pack, a Greyshard, Kedok, and the female we call Ness, for advanced boundary fever, without authorization, without a sponsoring house, and without prior petition to the Crown." The council's senior member, Aldrich Fenn, who was old enough to have served my father and precise enough to have served him well, set his notes in order and did not look up. The charge is trespass within a sovereign pack boundary. The penalty, absent any mitigating circumstance, is a formal censure and a period of supervised exclusion from the border territories. I looked down at Maren Ashby. She was already looking up at me. "Would you like to tell me what happened?" I said. She shifted the strap of her satchel. "I was traveling the old Fenway Road. It passes within half a mile of your boundary line. That's not trespass, it's public track, and I checked before I left Corderam." She said this without accusation, simply stating a fact that she felt was relevant. I heard wolves in the tree line, not howling, the other sound, the one that means something is wrong. I've been a healer long enough to know the difference. "Go on," I said. "I found them about 40 minutes in. 2 of the smaller ones were down, and the gray one was still on his feet, but he wouldn't be for much longer." It was boundary fever, the kind that sets into the joint tissue if you don't treat it in the first 2 days. I had the supplies. She paused. I knew I was crossing the line. I crossed it anyway. Aldrich Fenn set down his pen. You knew it was Crown territory and you crossed regardless. Yes. You did not attempt to send word to the nearest Crown post before entering. The nearest Crown post is 4 miles from where I was standing, and the gray wolf's fever was already at the stage where another few hours would have done permanent damage. She looked at him with the same steady patience she had looked at everything else. I made a judgment. I stand by it. Fenn's expression did not change, but I knew him well enough to read the slight tension in his jaw for what it was. He was not angry. He was, I thought, trying to decide whether he respected her. I understood the feeling exactly. The wolves are alive, I said. Yes, my lord. Grayshard, Keddock, and Ness, I said. You knew their names. Something shifted in her face, not discomfort, more like careful thought. Your captain told me on the road, I asked. Why? She seemed to consider the question genuinely. It's easier to work with an animal when you know what to call it. They respond to their names even when they can't respond to much else. She paused. Ness in particular. She kept trying to get up. I kept having to tell her to stay still. She needed something to anchor to. I sat with that for a moment. Around the hall's edges, I was not paying close attention to my wolves, and I should have been. Fenn had returned to his notes. 2 of the younger council members were conferring quietly. The formal machinery of a border trespass hearing was moving forward in the way it always did, and I was watching it move and thinking that something in the hall had changed in a way I could not yet name. Fenn addressed Marin again. Do you hold a healer's license under the Velthar Crown Compact, or under any neighboring territory's compact that would confer reciprocal rights? No. Are you sponsored by any house, pack, or recognized guild? No. Do you hold any standing that would give you legal standing to cross a crown boundary for the purpose of rendering aid? Marin Ashby looked at him for a moment. Then she said, No, I'm an independent healer. I don't belong to a house or a pack or a guild. I've been working the road territories between Cordoram and the Ashfin border for 4 years. I treat what I find. She settled the satchel strap. I treated what I found. Fenn began to speak. He did not finish. The silence came first. I had been a king for long enough to know that there are silences that mean absence, the fire going low, the hall emptying, and silences that mean presence. The sudden kind, where something presses into the room and every living thing in it turns toward the pressure without quite knowing why. The kind of silence you feel in your chest before you understand it. That was the silence that fell over Ashenmere Keep's great hall. I looked up from Fenn. The wolves had risen. Not 2 or 3 of them, not the young ones who startled at noise. All of them, all 23. They had come up from the hearthstone and from the wall places and from the shadows behind the council benches, and they were standing, bodies angled, heads turned, facing her. Sareth, who had been lying with his chin on his paws for what felt like a year's worth of mornings, was on his feet. The old Pale was on his feet beside him. The old Pale had not moved with purpose in a decade. I know this because I had stopped expecting him to, and kings do not stop expecting things unless the absence has been long enough to become fact. He was standing now. I heard one of the younger council members make a small, involuntary sound. I heard Hendrik very carefully not make any sound at all. I heard the fire in the hearth, which had been crackling in its ordinary way, settle into a low and steady burning, as though the hall itself had taken a slower breath. Marin Ashby had gone very still. She was not frightened. I was watching her face. I had been watching her face since she walked in, though I had not admitted this to myself until this moment, and what I saw there was not fear. It was the look of someone who is witnessing something they do not have an explanation for and is not going to pretend they do. She was looking at the old pail. The old pail was looking at her. And in the space between that look and the next breath I took, something in me that had been locked at a depth I had not visited in 11 years opened like a gate. I did not name it immediately. I am a careful man, but I felt it. I stood. I did not plan to stand. I was sitting in the high seat of Ashenmere Keep, and then I was standing, and the difference between those two states had not involved any decision I was aware of making. The high seat is not a place one leaves without ceremony, without announcement, without the formal steps that my father taught me and his father taught him. I left it anyway. I came down the 3 stone steps to the hall floor. The wolves did not move. They stood where they had risen, facing her, and the hall held its collective breath and held it, and no one in it, not Fenn, not the junior council members, not Hendrik, not the guards at the far door, made a sound. I crossed the hall. I stopped in front of Marin Ashby. She looked up at me. I am taller than most men and considerably taller than she was, and she looked up without any performance of smallness, simply adjusting the angle the way you'd adjust your eyes to a window. Level. Clear. "My lord," she said, and the title was respectful and not quite deferential, the voice of a woman who understood rank and was not overwhelmed by it. "Marin Ashby," I said. "Yes." I looked at her. I looked at the 23 wolves who had risen without signal to face her. I looked at Sareth, who had the quiet bearing of an elder and the eyes of something very ancient, and I looked at the old pail, who was still watching her with an expression I could only have described as recognition, if I were willing to believe that very old wolves recognized things that kings were still catching up to. I was willing. "My counsel," I said without turning, "is going to need a few moments." Fenn made a sound. It was, I knew, a diplomatic sound, the specific noise a man makes when he is choosing not to say the obvious thing and would like the silence noted. I noted it. I had been noting Fenn's silences for 11 years. I said to Marin, "Will you walk with me?" She considered it. "Am I still under the trespass charge?" "The wolves have offered their opinion on the trespass charge," I said. "I intend to follow their counsel." Something moved in her expression. Not quite a smile, but in the direction of one, the particular movement of a person who has heard something unexpected and is deciding how much to trust it. She settled the satchel strap on her shoulder. "All right," she said. The keep had a gallery that ran along the south wall above the great hall, accessible by a narrow stair that most people didn't know was there, because it had no practical function, and I had never announced it. I had spent a considerable portion of my adolescence in that gallery, sitting on the rail and watching my father's councils below, and I had been going back to it in the 11 years since his death because old habits are harder to break than you would think. I took Marin up the stair. She went without hesitation, which told me she was not afraid of heights or of narrow stairwells or of going somewhere unfamiliar with a man she had just met, which told me something else about her. The gallery was long and open on the hall side, looking down over the torchlit space below where the council was now conferring in the hushed and pointed way of men who had witnessed something they did not have a framework for and were building one in real time. 3 of my wolves, including Sareth, had settled themselves below the stair, as though they had decided the gallery was part of the perimeter and intended to hold it. I leaned against the rail and looked at Marin Ashby. "Tell me about the boundary fever," I said. She set her satchel down on the gallery floor and leaned against the opposite wall, arms folded. "You want the healer's version or the simple version? The one that explains why you didn't send for help?" She was quiet for a moment, and I had the sense of someone who was used to giving answers that were true rather than answers that were convenient, and was taking the time to make sure she had the right one. "Boundary fever is fast when it sets in," she said. "In the first day, it looks like ordinary exhaustion. In the second day, it starts to move into the joints. By the third day, if it's gone untreated, it's in the deep tissue and the recovery is much longer and harder and sometimes incomplete. When I found your wolves, Greyshard and Kedek were already at the second stage. Ness was earlier, but she was also the smallest and she would have tipped into the third faster. She paused. Sending for help and waiting for help to arrive are different things. I didn't have the waiting time. You could have sent word and gone back to the road, I said. She looked at me steadily. Yes. I waited. I didn't, she said. Why? She thought about it, and it was real thinking, not a performance of thought, the slight inward focus of a person actually reviewing something, not reaching for a rehearsed answer. I don't know how to leave something that I can help, she said finally. I've tried. It doesn't take. She said this with a dry matter-of-factness that told me she had long ago made peace with this feature of herself, however much inconvenience it had caused her. I looked at her for a long moment. You've been working the road territories for 4 years, I said. Yes. Alone. Yes. No pack, no house, no guild. I said it not as a charge the way Finn had, but as a statement I was trying to understand. Why? She was quiet again in that same careful way. Then she said, I had a pack once. It dissolved not through any dramatic means, just the ordinary way of things. People move, circumstances change, and eventually there was no pack. I tried the guild route for a while. It was, she seemed to be finding the right word, not a good fit. I prefer to work at my own pace on my own terms and answer to my own judgment. She looked at me with perfect seriousness. I understand that's not useful information in a trespass hearing. No, I agreed, but I'm not conducting a trespass hearing anymore. What are you conducting? I thought about that. I had come down from the high seat of Ashenmere Keep for the first time in memory, without ceremony and without announcement. I had walked across my own great hall while 23 wolves stood witness, and the old pale watched with those ancient, quiet eyes. I had asked a woman I had met 30 minutes ago to walk with me to the one part of the keep I went to when I needed to think, and she had come without hesitation. And now, she was standing in the torchlight with her healer's satchel at her feet, looking at me with the level, clear eyes of someone who was genuinely asking the question. I'm not sure yet, I said, but I don't think you're going anywhere. She tilted her head. My lord. Kedron, I said. Something shifted in her expression again. That same small movement that wasn't quite a smile and was more than consideration. She looked at me for a moment, and then she looked down at the hall below, where Finn was still conferring with his colleagues, and Hendrik was standing by the wall with the careful expression of a man who has understood more than he's been told. The old one, she said quietly. The pale one, he moved for me. Yes. Do you know why? I'm beginning to, I said. She absorbed this. You should probably explain it to me. I thought so too, but the explanation was going to require me to say things I had not said aloud in 11 years. Things I had largely stopped saying even to myself, because the hope of them had grown faint enough that naming them felt more like grief than expectation. I looked at the gallery rail under my hands, the wood worn smooth by decades of the same grip. In Velthar, I said, a king's wolves are not decorative, they are not ceremony, they are, I chose the word carefully, discerning. They respond to things that the rest of us have to reason toward, a person's worth, for instance. Their nature, the question of whether they belong. I paused. They've never done what they did this morning, not for anyone who came through those doors. Marin was quiet. The old pale hasn't moved with purpose since my father's time, I said. He stopped not because he was sick, not because he was old in the way of decline. He stopped when my mother died. She was the one he chose then, before my father understood what was happening. I paused again, aware that I was saying more than I had planned to. He has been waiting. Marin looked at me. I had the sense of a woman who was taking something in very carefully, the way you handle a piece of information that is too significant to rush. That's a long time to wait, she said. Yes. For me specifically, she said, and it was not a question, but it was not a statement either. It was the sound of someone verifying a fact they had just been handed and were holding in both hands to examine. "I believe so," I said. "The bond, what we call the fated bond in Velthar, isn't something I can manufacture. It isn't something my council votes on or my laws define. The wolves feel it before I do, apparently." I looked at her. "Before I am willing to name it in any case." She considered this for a long time. Below us, the hall was quieter now, the council having reached some collective state of paused deliberation. The fire at the hearth had settled to its low, steady burning. Sarith was still at the base of the stair. "I want to be clear," Marin said at last, "that I didn't come here for this. I came here because 3 wolves were dying and I had the means to help them. I didn't know whose wolves they were. I didn't know what court I'd end up in. I wasn't," she paused, as though finding the exact right word was important, "positioning myself." "I know," I said. "How do you know?" "Because you asked to finish bandaging Grayshard's leg before my captain brought you in," I said. She was quiet again. Then, and I thought I saw, in the torchlight, the slight softening at the corners of her eyes that meant something had landed. "Your captain told you that. He thought I'd want to know." She looked down at the hall. He was right. We were in the gallery for a long time. Longer, I think, than either of us intended. The keep went about its mourning around us. I heard the kitchens beginning and the stable yard and the ordinary business of a working court, and neither of us hurried it. Marin asked questions the way she did everything else, with an unhurried precision that told me she was building an understanding rather than gathering ammunition. She asked about the bond, and I explained it as honestly as I could, that it was not compulsion, that it was not an obligation I was placing on her, that what the wolves had declared was a kind of recognition, and that what I chose to do with that recognition was a question I was asking, not answering for her. She listened with her arms folded and her head slightly tilted, and when I was done she asked 3 follow-up questions, each of which was better than the last. She asked about Velthar. I told her about the drowned forest, the old timber trade routes that had made the kingdom what it was, the boundary territories and why they mattered, the border fever that had been moving through the pack line for 2 seasons, and why my healers had been struggling to contain it. At that she sat forward. "What are they using?" she said. "For the fever." "Yes, what treatment?" I told her what I knew, which was the general shape of what my healer general had reported. She listened, asked 2 sharp questions, and then said, "They're treating the fever itself and not the vector. The fever isn't the problem, it's a symptom of a specific fungal bloom that comes up in the boundary line soil after wet seasons. You have to address the bloom at the root level, or the fever will keep recurring all along the line." She said this with the quiet certainty of someone who has figured something out and is stating the answer, not selling it. "I've seen it 3 times in the road territories. I worked out the treatment pattern in my 2nd year." I looked at her. "You have been traveling the road territories for 4 years," I said slowly, "treating a condition that has been troubling my border pack for 2 seasons, and you worked out the correct treatment approach 2 years before my healer general began reporting the problem." She seemed to be calculating. "Yes, roughly." "Alone," I said, "with no guild, no house, no sponsorship, and no crown authorization." "I did have a very good botanical reference," she said, with a precise and serious tone that made me understand she was not being funny and was not trying to be, which made it funnier than anything she could have tried to do. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "I would like to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly." "I generally do," she said. "Do you want to stay?" She was quiet. "Not because of the bond," I said. "Not because of the old Pale or Sarith or the 23 wolves who apparently have opinions. Because of," I looked at the gallery rail, then at her, "what you could do here. What Velthar could offer you in return. I am aware that I am a king asking a question that has an obvious pressure to it, and I want you to know that I am asking it anyway because I believe you are entirely capable of saying no." She looked at me for a long time. "What would I be staying for?" she said. It was not a deflection. It was the practical question of someone who needed to understand the offer before she could evaluate it. "A position," I said, "your own scope of work. The border territories officially, with Crown authorization and whatever resources you need. The access to work, the treatment approach you've already developed, on the scale it needs." I paused. "And whatever else you decide you want to know about what the wolves declared this morning." Marin Ashby looked at her healer's satchel at her feet. She looked at the hall below, where Fenn was now sitting alone at the council table with his notes, and the particular posture of a man who had decided to be patient. She looked at the base of the stair, where Soreth had settled with his chin on his paws. "My terms," she said. "Name them." "My own rooms," she said. "Not adjacent to the king's quarters unless I decide otherwise. My own schedule for the border work. I report outcomes, not hours. My healer's practice remains mine. I am not Crown property. I am a Crown-affiliated independent with the ability to leave if the arrangement no longer serves." She said all of this steadily, watching my face. "And Ness recovers fully." "Ness is already recovering," I said. "Hendrik sent word this morning she's eating." Something crossed Marin's face, relief, quick and real, the relief of someone who had been carrying a concern and put it down. She covered it almost immediately, but not quite, and I was glad I had been watching. "Those are my terms," she said. "They're accepted," I said, "all of them." She looked at me with that level, considering look, and I had the sense of someone who had been told yes by institutions before, and was assessing whether this particular yes would hold. "Just like that," she said. "You crossed a Crown boundary to save 3 wolves who were dying," I said, "because leaving them was not something you knew how to do. You've been treating a border-wide problem for 2 years ahead of my own healers. You set your terms to me without hedging in a keep where you arrived under a trespass charge." I looked at her. Just like that. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she picked up her healer's satchel and stood, and I stood with her, and she looked at me with an expression I could not entirely read. It was careful and warm at once, the face of a woman who was making a decision she had not expected to make today and was making it clearly. "All right," she said, "I'll stay." We came back down the gallery stair into the great hall. Fenn looked up from his notes. The council members who had been conferring had arranged themselves back into their formal places, with the patient readiness of people who had been waiting for the principals to finish their separate discussion, and had strong feelings about being kept waiting, which they were going to be professional about. Hendrik stood by the wall. The guards at the far door were very carefully standing exactly as they had been. The wolves had not moved from where they had risen. 23 of them, still standing, still facing the hall's floor, still patient, in the way that wolves are patient when they have made a decision, and are waiting for the humans to catch up to it. I walked to the center of the hall. "I am closing the trespass charge," I said. Fenn set down his pen in the way that meant he had anticipated this and accepted it. "Noted, my lord." Marin Ashby is to be registered as a Crown-affiliated healer, with exclusive territorial authorization for the eastern boundary line territories and advisory scope for the border fever work. I paused. She will also be extended a formal standing in this court as my guest, pending, I chose the word, further discussion. Fenn looked at me over his papers. He had been my father's man and my man for a long combined period, and in that time he had developed a very precise vocabulary of looks. The one he was giving me now said, "I understand what you are not saying, my lord, and I think you might want to say it." He was right, but not yet. I turned to Marin. She was standing at my left, her satchel over her shoulder, watching the proceedings with the same calm, unhurried attention with which she had watched everything since she walked through the doors. "There is one more thing I would like to say," I said to the hall, while the full court is present. Fenn set his pen down properly this time and folded his hands. The wolves of Ashenmere Keep rose without signal or command this morning and gave their recognition to this woman, I said. All 23 of them, including Sareth and including the old Pale, who last moved at my father's recognition of his bond and has not done so since. I looked at the old Pale, who was watching me from across the hall with those patient, ancient eyes. I am the last person in this room to name what that means. The wolves named it before I did. The court bore witness before I could speak to it. I paused. I am naming it now for the record so that there is no ambiguity. This is a recognition, a faded recognition, and I intend to honor it at the pace and in the manner that Maren Ashby herself determines. There was a silence in the hall. It was not the tense silence of a court receiving a decision it had not expected. It was the other kind, the kind that follows something that was already known and needed only to be said aloud. Fenn said quietly and precisely, "Noted, my lord, for the record." Hendrik said nothing. But I saw, in the way I had learned to see things about Hendrik, that he was satisfied, in the particular way of a man who had sent a message saying she asked to finish bandaging the gray one's leg before we left. I thought you'd want to know, and had been right. I looked at Maren. I told you, I said quietly, so only she could hear, that you'd find I meant what I said. She looked at me with those clear, level eyes. You did tell me that, she said. Did you believe me? She considered it with her characteristic care. I was getting there, she said. That was the beginning of it. Not the end. The beginning is never the end. And anyone who has told you otherwise has abbreviated the story to its best parts and cut out the texture that gives the best parts their weight. The weeks that followed were full of the ordinary complications of a new arrangement settling into a life that had been arranged one way for a long time. There was the practical business of Maren's rooms, which she chose herself, the South Tower, high enough to see the boundary line on a clear day, with a window large enough to keep her herbs in, and the credential documentation, which Fenn handled with his customary precision, and Maren reviewed line by line with a thoroughness that made even Fenn look approving. There was the border fever work, which she began within 3 days of arriving, and which proceeded with the same unhurried efficiency that characterized everything she did. The bloom treatment approach she had developed in 4 years of road work was, as she had said it was, the correct one. This was confirmed by my healer general within a fortnight, who had the grace and the wisdom to say so without being asked. The border fever cases in the Eastern Territories began to resolve. By the 2nd month, the new cases had dropped to almost nothing. The wolves visited her every morning. Not in any dramatic way. Ashenmere's wolves did not do things dramatically. They were too old and too certain for spectacle. But they came. Sareth in particular developed the habit of appearing at the South Tower's base in the early morning and sitting there until Maren came down for her herbs, at which point he would accompany her to the kitchen garden and then return to his post by the hearthstone as though this was simply the schedule and always had been. The old Pale visited less often, but when he did, he stayed. Maren, for her part, treated this with the same matter-of-fact acceptance she brought to most things. She had learned in 4 years of road work to read animal behavior, and what she read in Sareth and the old Pale she absorbed and filed. She told me once in the South Tower late in the 2nd month that she had been alone for long enough that she had stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing the weight of something you carry every day, and that what she had noticed in Ashenmere was the absence of that weight. I told her I knew what she meant. She looked at me and said, "I know you do," and there was a quality in the way she said it that told me she had been watching me as carefully as I had been watching her, and that what she had observed she had found, I allowed myself to think, not objectionable. I did not rush it. I want to be clear about that because it matters. I did not rush it. The bond had been declared, The court had noted it. Fenn had written it into the record. But Marin's terms were her own, and she had said whatever else you decide you want to know about what the wolves declared, and I had accepted those terms, and a man who accepts terms must hold to them. I held to them. What I did was this. I was present. I showed up to her border fever reports, which she gave twice monthly in the South Tower at a table covered in botanical diagrams, and I listened with the attention the reports deserved. I ate meals in the hall when she ate in the hall and did not require it when she didn't. I asked her questions about the road territories and about what she had seen in 4 years of working them, and she answered them with that characteristic precision and occasional dryness, and sometimes, increasingly, with a warmth that was not in the first answers she had given me in the gallery. In the 3rd month, she came to my study in the evening and sat in the chair across from my desk and said, "I've been thinking about what you said in the gallery, about the bond." "Which part?" I said. "The part where you said it wasn't compulsion," she said, "and the part where you said the wolves declared it before you were willing to name it." She looked at me steadily. "I've been thinking about whether I would have come to the same place without the wolves. Without the old pail moving, without the formal declaration. If I had just walked in, answered the hearing, and been sent on my way." She paused. "I think I would have wanted to come back. I'm not sure I would have had a reason." I was quiet. "I'm not saying that the bond manufactured something that wasn't there," she said carefully. "I'm saying the wolves gave me a reason to stay long enough to find out whether something was there." She looked at me. "Something is there. I wanted to say that clearly." I looked at her for a long moment. In the firelight of my study, she had the look of a person who has made a decision after careful consideration, and is presenting it as a fact because that is how she presents things, without ceremony, without performance, with the directness of someone who considers straightforwardness a form of respect. "Thank you for saying it clearly," I said. She nodded, as though something had been concluded, and then she said, "Now tell me what the protocol is for the spring boundary inspection, because I want to be part of it and Fenn keeps redirecting me to the junior clerk." I told Fenn the next morning that Marin Ashby was to be included in the spring boundary inspection without redirect, and Fenn said, "Yes, my lord," and wrote it down with the manner of a man who had been expecting this particular instruction for some time. The spring boundary inspection was 3 weeks long. We rode the eastern line from Greyton's Crossing to the mouth of the Ashfin, which was the full extent of the territory she had been treating, and Marin moved through it with the familiarity of someone who had worked it on foot for years, and was now seeing it from a different angle. She knew the soil types and the drainage patterns and the bloom cycles better than any of my border wardens, and she spent the inspection teaching the wardens what she knew, without condescension and without the expectation of credit, simply because it needed to be known, and she had the knowledge. I rode beside her when I could. We talked the way we had been talking in the South Tower and in my study, the long, unhurried way of two people who have discovered they are interested in what the other one thinks and are not in a hurry to use up the supply. She asked about Velthar's history. I asked about the road territories. She had stories about them that were funny and some that were sad and some that were both, and she told them with the same dry precision that she brought to the botanical diagrams and the healer's reports, and somewhere in the 2nd week I understood that I was very happy. I am not sure when I had last been able to say that simply and mean it. On the last evening of the inspection, we were at the eastern camp, the one that sits at the highest point of the boundary line where you can see the drowned forest's canopy going silver in the late light. The rest of the party had drawn back to the fire. I was standing at the camp's edge with Marin, and she was looking at the forest, and after a long silence she said, "Kedron." "Yes," I said. "I want to name it," she said. I looked at her. "I know your terms," I said, "your pace, whatever you decide." "I'm deciding," she said. "I want to name it." She turned and looked at me with those clear, level eyes, and there was something in them now that had not been in them in the gallery all those months ago. Not a softening exactly. Marin's eyes were not the softening kind, but an opening, an adjustment in the angle as though she had recalibrated her sight to include me in the field. I'm deciding that I want this. You, Velthar, the wolves apparently having opinions about my schedule, Fenn's redirecting being redirected back. All of it. She paused. I'm deciding. I said, then I accept. She looked at me for a moment, and then she did something she had not done in the gallery or the South Tower or the study. She laughed. It was not a large laugh, but it was a real one, the sound of someone who has said something that was very serious and appreciated that the response had been exactly right and found that funny. Just like that, she said. Just like that, I said. The formal recognition was held in the great hall of Ashenmere Keep on a morning in late summer, when the drowned forest had come into its full color, and the hall's dark wood walls held the warmth of the season. Fenn had the paperwork, as Fenn always had the paperwork. My council was present. The border wardens who had ridden the Eastern inspection were present. Hendrik was present, with the look of a man who was glad to be there. The wolves were there. All 23 of them, as they had been on the morning Marin walked in under a trespass charge. Sareth and the old Pale at the front, as they had been. The old Pale was watching with the same ancient patience he had watched with that first morning, the patience of something that had been waiting a very long time and was now, finally, on the right side of the wait. Marin came in from the South Tower's side door, not the great doors. She had specified this in her planning of the ceremony, as she had specified several other things, because Marin planned things that were hers to plan, and the ceremony was partly hers to plan. She was wearing deep green, which she had chosen because it was practical and because she liked it, and her hair was pinned with somewhat more intention than it had been on the morning of the trespass hearing, and she carried no healer's satchel because, for this particular occasion, she had left it in the South Tower. She walked to the center of the hall and stopped. The wolves rose, all 23, without signal, without sound, without instruction, as they had done before, and it was no less affecting for being expected. If anything, it was more, because now I knew what it cost the old Pale to rise, and I knew why he did, and I had come, in the months between, to understand what it meant to be the last in the room to understand something that was already certain. I came down from the high seat. I crossed the hall. I stopped in front of her. Marin Ashby, I said. Kedron Voss, she said. And then I did what I had wanted to do since the morning she walked into the gallery and asked her questions with the unhurried precision of someone who intended to have accurate information. I took her hand. Her hand was a healer's hand, practical and sure, and it held mine back without hesitation, with the same directness she brought to everything. Fenn cleared his throat in the formal way. He read the registration of bond and recognition into the Crown record, because that is what Fenn does, and he does it well, and he had been my father's man and my man long enough that I knew he was genuinely pleased even when his voice was at its most official. When he was done, he looked at his notes and then at me over his spectacles and said, with the precision of a man who had been waiting to say this for some months, "All recorded, my lord." "Thank you, Aldrich," I said. He blinked. I had not called him by his given name in 11 years. He decided after a moment that this was also noted and wrote something in the margin. Marin, beside me, said quietly, "He's going to put that in the margin." "He already did," I said. She looked sideways at me. "You know his tells." 11 years, I said. "I've had 3 months," she said. "I've almost got them." I believed her. I believed her entirely. Marin Ashby had spent 4 years working the road territories, reading animals and soil and drainage patterns, and the particular shape of a fever in its second day. And she had come to Ashenmere Keep with a healer's satchel, and the habit of saying exactly what she meant. And she had, in 3 months, worked out Fenn's tells and Hendrik's silences, and the names of all 23 wolves and the old Pale's morning schedule, and the best angle from the South Tower window for the boundary line on a clear day. She had also, somewhere in the second month, worked out that I took the gallery stair in the evenings when I needed to think, and had begun leaving a lamp at the base of it, because the stair was dark and she had, she said, a professional objection to preventable injuries. I had found that lamp every evening since. The hall was full of morning light and wolves, and the patient, anchored quiet of a place that has come to the right arrangement and knows it. Sarith was at my left. The old Pale was at Marin's right, closer than I had seen him stand to anyone since my mother's time, with the expression, if wolves could be said to have expressions, and Velthar's wolves could, anyone who had spent time with them knew this, of a creature who had been very patient for a very long time and was, at last, finished waiting. Marin looked at the old Pale. "Good morning," she said to him, in the same practical, direct voice she used for everything. The old Pale looked at her. Then he settled. Not lay down, settled, in the particular way of a very old wolf who has chosen his place and intends to keep it, his great pale head lowering to a level just below her hand, close enough that, if she reached down, she would reach him. She reached down. And that was that. I am told, by the council and by Hendrik and by Finn's official record, that the formal recognition of Marin Ashby as the bondmate and Luna of Ashenmere took place in the great hall of Velthar's court in the late summer of my 12th year of reign. This is accurate. The record also notes, accurately, that all 23 of the keep's wolves were present and rose without signal and recognition, including Sarith and the one we had always called the Old Pale, and that the bond was formally registered in the Crown Compact, and that Marin Ashby's appointment as Crown-affiliated healer for the Eastern Boundary Territories was confirmed concurrent with the recognition, and that the border fever cases in those territories had dropped to 0 by the time of the ceremony. Finn's record does not note, because Finn's records, however thorough, are addressed to the Crown Compact and not to posterity in the personal sense, that the Old Pale did not return to the Hearthstone afterward. He stayed at the South Tower. He had, it seemed, decided that the South Tower was where he was meant to be, now that the person he had been waiting for was there. I visited the South Tower often. I had always visited it, but now I had reasons that were warmer than memory, and I visited it more. On an evening in the first week after the recognition, I went up to find Marin at her work table, botanical diagrams spread across it, the lamp she kept by the window making the whole room amber. Sarith was asleep in the doorway. The Old Pale was in the corner with his eyes half open, in the way he had, as though he was keeping watch even when he looked at rest. Marin looked up when I came in. She looked at me the way she had looked at the drowned forest in the late light from the eastern camp, with that open, recalibrated angle that included me in the field. "The third quarter Bloom report," she said, "is going to be interesting." "Tell me," I said, and sat down across from her, and she told me. Outside, the drowned forest was going to its night colors, and the boundary line held quiet, and the fever that had troubled it for 2 seasons was spent, and the wolves of Ashenmere were settled in their places, and the Old Pale kept watch with his ancient eyes half open, as he would for the years that followed, as long as he was needed, which was, it turned out, a good long while yet. I had been the last in the room to understand. I had made peace with this. Some things are worth arriving at late, as long as you arrive. I had arrived.